Today's program, allow me to introduce Matt Wulff, who is a researcher, author, and living historian. A reenactor and researcher for over 20 years, his research led to the publication of his first book, Robert Rogers' Rules for the Ranging Service, an Analysis. In the next decade, 3 more publications would follow. Matt's special interest is in the colonial ranger of the 17th and 18th century in North America. Currently, he's a staff writer for Muzzle Loader magazine. So his topic today is Rogers Rangers, Innovative Troops and Tactics for a New World. Please welcome Matt Wulff.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm going to start out by apologizing, though. I just finished this PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to give to you today, and I have no idea how long it's going to take, and I kind of tend to run along after a while. So if I get long-winded, it's just my nature. So when Bill asked me a few months ago if I'd be interested in talking about Rogers Rangers, I kind of started out in the beginning. I kind of started to think back of how I got interested in Colonial Rangers, Rogers, and his corps of Rangers specifically. And it actually started, my son, who was about 12 years old at the time, he's 35 now, so we had just started as a family getting interested in living history events, and we'd gone to a few, and we were at this event, and my son saw these guys running around in these green uniforms, and he said, "Hey, what's that all about? That kind of looks kind of cool." And I said, "Oh, I have no idea, So we did some looking around, and we found that out that these guys were members of Rogers Rangers. And again, I had no idea what they were, so we went out and we bought the best book that you could buy on Rogers Rangers. It was Rogers Rangers Sketchbook, and that was our Bible. And over the years, the next couple of years, we bought our green uniforms that you'll see Rogers Rangers wearing, and we all had the same musket, and we all had the same canteen, and we all had the same bayonet, and we all had the same hatchet, and the same blue bonnets, and boy, we were cool. I mean, we were about the best thing that you could have. And if you would have asked me all those years ago about Rogers Rangers, I would have told you that was the first ranger group in the colonies. They were the best that ever were, the best that ever will be. They kicked the French butt every time that they faced them. These guys were unstoppable. They were, the supermen of the colonies. Well, about that time, we were in an event, and of course I had my wonderful green uniform on. And I had a person that was there, just part of the public that was there to see the event, came up to me and says, "You guys are doing Rogers Rangers?" And I said, "Yeah, we're just getting started." And he said, "Well," he goes, "I belong to this organization called Jaggers Battalion. They're headquartered in Michigan. But," he goes, "they're the nation's largest and oldest recreated Rogers Rangers group in the nation." And we're like, wow. It's very interesting, because I've learned over the years that if you can find a good historically based organization to join up with or to utilize their research, it's a lot easier road to go down than trying to do it yourself. And I quickly learned, as I was trying to attain the rank of Private Ranger, one of the requirements was a list of reading that you had to do. And so I knuckled down. I want to find out all I can about these guys, So I knuckled down and I started reading, and I found out that everything that I thought I knew about Rogers Rangers was wrong. I mean, I was probably about as far in the opposite direction as the guy could go. And that was when I was also introduced to research. In my research originally, and it still is, it's not to make money, it's not to sell a ton of books and things like that. My research has always been an attempt to make myself a better reenactor. It doesn't do me any good to stand up here and give a presentation if I don't know what I'm talking about. So I wanted to be a good reenactor, I wanted to be a good living historian, and so when I started to learn about research through Jaeger's Battalion, that really put me on the right path. And so my PowerPoint today is going to be kind of a little bit of that journey. And basically, we're going to start right at the beginning, because what I once thought was the only ranger group in existence in the colonies turned out to be just one of many. Give me the next slide now. And I'm going to probably concentrate on one side. I'm not used to two screens, and I was lucky that everybody kind of came this way a little bit. But the term ranger. Most historians believe that the first time that you started to see that term ranger was in medieval Europe. And what these guys were is they were woodsmen hired not in a military context like we know them today, especially Rogers Rangers, but they protected the king's game from poachers, things like that, bandits. They were just kind of basically the king's own little police force. In 1371, Henry Dowling and Thomas of Croydon were employed as rangers in New Forest and Waltham. That's in England. And also, I came across men that were called borderers. Scotland and England, you know, most of you will know, had a ton of problems between the two nations. And these men would actually patrol the areas along the border between Scotland and England and basically try to keep the peace. So they became known as borderers. Now, one of the things that I learned, though, when I started to research colonial rangers, was that really there was a unique connection between North America and what we know as our colonial rangers. The Native American tribes and the very terrain and the untamed wilderness that North America was really had a lot to do with the development of these rangers that we know right now. In the beginning, it actually started with the beginning of what we now know is the United States, the Jamestown settlement in Virginia. You know, a lot of people check out Pocahontas, Disney movies, everything was great, you know. The natives didn't really like us at first, but they were willing to work with us, and we all came together and stuff like this. But pretty soon after the settlement was starting to establish and grow, they began to have problems with the native tribes. Hunting grounds, the land that people were starting to settle on and everything. A lot of your common complaints that you will find between the native tribes and the English colonists began to emerge. And the settlers in Jamestown pretty much responded the way that they always had. They would build a fort, and they would begin to fortify these things. Everything was great. We got this nice stronghold in the middle of the native, you know, land, so we're not going to have a problem with it. This is a diagram of the fort at Jamestown. It was a triangular stockade with bastions for artillery. Pretty formidable when you have a native tribe that's not used to seeing something like this. So, hey, everything's great. You got your fort built, you're not going to have problems anymore. Next slide. Well, That's okay, but you can't raise your livestock, you can't farm, and you can't just enjoy everyday life from inside that stockade. There's times that you're going to have to go outside that fort. And so they decided we need a bigger military presence to help protect ourselves. So they once again went back to what they were used to in Europe, and that was what they called trained bands. These were basically what we know as militia companies, citizen soldiers. One thing that England did not believe in was a big professional army. They like to use a lot of militias. It was less expensive to, for one reason and things. But these early militias were armed with equipment that was ill-suited for what we saw the need here in the different terrain in the wilderness, and also against the native tribes. It was just ill-suited. It may have worked great over in Europe, but it just wasn't going to work very well here. This is just a depiction of an early English militiaman. He's armed with a matchlock musket. It was so heavy that it required a stand so that he could aim it well. He's equipped with a bandolier of what they call the 12 Apostles, with his powder charges and things like that. He carried a sword because once that musket was empty, it took so long to reload. A lot of times he would have to resort to his sidearm, his sword. Well, these problems began to continue to escalate. Captain John Smith was the original military leader during the settlement of Jamestown. And it was through him that I actually saw the first reference to ranging in North America. It was back in England in 1622. And he heard about the problems with the native war that was going on over there. And he actually wrote this in his book about the settlement of North America. He said, "If you please, I may be transported with 100 captain soldiers," which, as near as I could tell, was just the very best that he could get, "and 30 sailors. These I would employ in ranging the countries and tormenting the savages, and that they should be as a running army till this were effected." So here, all of a sudden, is a quote about ranging in the colonies, 130 years before Robert Rogers ever existed as his ranging corps. Smith never returned to Europe, but the concept kind of took a foothold. Now, I don't know how that happened. It may have just been a natural progression. It may not have had anything to do with Smith's idea. But the term ranger in North America would have been men that wouldn't be assigned to a fort or to a garrison house. They would range a certain area of the colony or of the area that they were employed in as sort of an early warning system against Indian raids or things like this. They were lighter equipped. They were fast moving. They were able to sustain themselves out in the woods without being dependent on a supply line the way your normal military organizations. And while Smith never returned, in 1634 and 1635, this gentleman, Edward Backler, was hired as a ranger at Kent Island of Virginia Plantation, which is now part of Maryland. But basically what his duties were to make sure that that plantation never was raided. He wanted to give them an idea of what may be coming before. So these early rangers, again, were like an early warning system. Not so much a military aspect to what they were yet. Now, that's not to say that the militia organizations were horrible. The colonies were really spread out. So if you were having an army of citizen soldiers, it took a while to assemble these men. It took a while to equip them and get them ready for a potential raid. And a lot of times what they would find out is by the time that they made into a settlement who had been raided, a lot of times they basically were burying the dead and helped pick up the pieces because the natives had conducted a hit and run raid and were already headed back with their plunder and their prisoners by the time the militia came out. Well, with the Rangers in the field, if they could give that early warning, it was easier to get your militia organized faster. And so actually the Rangers and the militia were a good combination, especially early in the development of the colonies. It really started to take a little bit of a foothold, the Ranger concept in North America. 1648, Maryland was using them very extensively on their frontier. And you see in 1670, the Plymouth colony maintained a company of Rangers just for their colony, just not even the whole, just a very, very small settlement to actually employ a company of Rangers. Now we start to see, though, as things progress, that you start to see the Rangers being used in a military concept by the end of the 1600s. This was probably the biggest Native American uprising or Native war that the colonies had seen since their inception. 1675, 1676, it was one of the first times you saw a confederation of tribes come together to resist English encroachment on their lands. And it was called King Philip's War. Metacomet was, and I probably butchered that, but he was known as King Philip to the neighboring English that lived near his tribe. But he began an uprising against the English. And of course the English attempted to meet that threat, as they always had, by calling out their militia and building forts and things like this. This gentleman, Benjamin Church, is known as the father of the Rangers. He actually was one of the first inductees in the Ranger Hall of Fame down in Fort Benning in Georgia. Again, when I was starting out with Rogers Rangers, I had no idea that a man like this even existed. Benjamin Church was a Massachusetts militiaman. He had been trained the way that everybody else had been trained. You built forts, you garrisoned them. That was going to prevent native raids and things like that. It didn't work. He realized this right away, that in his first major engagement with the natives, they actually attacked a actual fortification in a swamp. And the natives actually funneled them into a killing zone. And he said after that engagement, he said he saw piles of his fellow militiamen laying dead in front of that native fortification. And also, even though they eventually were able to take that fortification, the natives just melted away into the swamp. They just were no match for the native tactics. And he realized that what they were doing just wasn't working anymore. Next slide. So he began to petition the governor of Massachusetts, who happened to be a good friend of his. And he said, let me raise a company of Rangers. And again, that common theme, these men would lie in the woods as the natives did. And they would operate independently of a main army. They wouldn't be dependent on a military supply train. Just as Captain Smith had suggested all those years before. But Church goes one more step. He not only wants them to fight the natives on their own terms, he wants to incorporate allied natives that are on the English side into his companies so that his men can quickly learn their tactics. He realizes that the only way to defeat them is to use their own tactics. Next slide. Okay, yeah, okay, sorry. That's a continuing slide. By mixing his company again, he wanted his men to learn their methods. What better way to defeat an enemy by emulating the tactics that they use against you? And so he started to teach his men, instead of fighting in linear formations, the way that they had for years, he taught his men how to fight spread out and thin, instead of in those tight ranks, because that's what the natives were doing. You didn't have a concentrated mass force to engage. Your men were spread out the same way that they were. It was also harder for the natives to flank and surround the linear formations that you'll see so many times in history. He actually came up with a list of rules for his Rangers, or I shouldn't say really a list of rules, but tactics that you will see a little bit later in Rogers Rangers. But 75 years prior to this, he would keep a portion of his men loaded in reserve instead of firing a volley all at once, so that he always had a reserve line of muskets. Because the natives they weren't dumb. They would realize that when a group of line troops would fire at you, that they were unloaded, and that's when they would rush in and make their push. He also was using watercraft to quickly get from places to place, wherever the need for his Ranger company were. He also realized that long matchlock muskets and pikes and things like that were the norm for militia organizations, it just weren't going to work in the woods and the swamps. So he began a push for lighter equipment. Lightweight flintlock muskets, knives, hatchets, cutlasses, shot bags and powder horns were utilized because of this type of duty that they were seeing. A paper cartridge just wasn't going to survive. He needed something that his men could go out and use that was going to stay waterproof. So that kind of established the Ranger tradition. They were not only used to continue to protect the frontier of the colonies. In fact, that's another underlying theme that I found throughout the course of my research, that as the frontier would move, even on into the 19th century, you always had Rangers employed along your frontiers. There were several wars that started to develop in North America after King Philip's War. And the thing that was different, it wasn't just against your Native American tribes. A new enemy had come to face the English colonies, and that was the French influence. The French and the English had finally come head to head to who was going to control the continent. There was a series of wars. The French and Indian War that we're talking about mainly today was a culmination of your earlier wars. Queen Anne's War, King George's War. The Rangers started to come up, and the English military themselves came up with a very formidable enemy. And that was a Canadian-born partisan soldier. Now, Canada also had militia laws. All your able-bodied men needed to belong to a militia. This was especially important in Canada because their populations were a lot smaller than the English colonies. But the Canadians adapted a lot quicker than the English did to the type of warfare, the natives types of fighting and things like that than the English did. The English were really playing catch-up. And throughout these three conflicts leading up to the French and Indian War, the need for Rangers increased as they began to meet this new threat. And especially, the French also had a lot stronger alliances with a lot of the tribes that really aided them early in their fight against the English. So the French and Indian War is really what I call the zenith of the colonial ranger. You had some ranger units during the frontier or the Revolutionary War, especially along the frontiers, but the French and Indian War in a military context for a Colonial Ranger is when they really hit their zenith. This was the high point of being a Colonial Ranger. That's part of the reasons that Robert Rogers and his Rangers are so famous and so well known. But there were a lot of different Rangers groups. Rogers Rangers is just one. Putnam's Rangers out of Connecticut were very famous. Gorham's Rangers were also, I mean, there was just a host of Ranger companies. In fact, they had become to be sort of an essential part of the military organization in the English colonies. Most of your provincial regiments at this time would include at least one company of Rangers. This is just a few of the hodgepodge of French and Indian War era Ranger uniforms that you would have seen. And you can kind of see not the uniforms that you expect out of the regular English Army. A lot of different styles of dress. They've got some mixed items, native moccasins, native leggings, things like this that they've learned through that adaptability with the native tribes of being integrated with groups like Church's Rangers, that these things work very well in the woods. So they started to utilize things like that even to a bigger extent. And so again, like I said, Robert Rogers and his Rangers, probably the most famous. Robert Rogers actually kept a journal of his exploits during the French and Indian War that had been republished many times. That's another reason why he's so famous, because as historians go look for something, if there's a written record of it, then that's just a boon to what we're trying to do. But it also helped with his fame. He started out, he was captain of a company of Rangers in Blanchard's New Hampshire Regiment. They were originally raised to go under Sir William Johnson against Crown Point in 1755. Well, that campaign didn't go off as planned, and it ended up, the Battle of Lake George occurred, where Johnson actually defeated a French force that was coming to try to stop his invasion of upper state New York at Crown Point. And after the Battle of Lake George, Johnson decided that besides Fort Edward, that controlled one area and one end of the portage route between the Hudson River and Lake George, he wanted to build Fort William Henry right at the south end of Lake George to control that portage route. So over the winter, when everybody else normally went into winter quarters, Johnson got to thinking, hey, it might be a good idea, because the French have got spies working all through the winter. Maybe it would be a good idea if I had spies to also operate during the winter months. And so he asked for a group of volunteers to stay over at Fort Edward and Fort William Henry during the winter of 1755 and 1756 to gather intelligence about the enemy. That way, when they started their campaign season in 1756, they would have good, solid information for that planning. And they did such a good job over that winter that they became really vital to the future planning of campaigns during the French and Indian War. And Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, he was the acting commander-in-chief after the death of General Braddock here in 1755, established two companies of independent Rangers. Now, what they meant by independent companies were they didn't belong to an established regiment. They were still going to be paid by the British Crown, and their needs taken care of by the Crown instead of by the colonies. But they did belong to an established regiment, so they could be disbanded at any time. And one of the things that you see, a common theme is with Church, Rogers also included a couple companies of Native Americans in his Ranger groups. Again, he was trying to get his men to act and emulate Native tactics. Now this is a print that was actually came out during the Revolutionary War. It's supposed to be Robert Rogers. Hundreds of these prints were made and sold in England. This print actually had him as commander of all the native tribes that were allied to the American cause during the Revolutionary War. They were, like I said, there was a series of generals for the American cause that were printed. I don't know whether they were as propaganda or just a money-making scheme in England. But this is supposedly Robert Rogers and his uniform as a ranger and how he was accoutered and things like this. But out of all these prints that were made, out of all these different guys, so many of the features were all the same that they think that it was just being mass produced to make money. The Rogers family descendants to this day discount this as having anything to do with an actual image of Robert Rogers. But at the time, this was especially early in my Robert Rogers days, this was how we dressed. You know, we had to make sure that we were just like this. In actuality, actually through 1758, the Rangers didn't have a uniform. They really weren't issued any type of military stores whatsoever. They gave them 10 Spanish dollars, were allowed to each man that enlisted in Rogers' quarters. He had to provide his own clothes, arms, and blankets. And he also wanted to enlist guys that were used to hunting and traveling and working back in the backwoods and the wilderness of the colonies that he could trust. But this is kind of the best idea that we can get about just what the Rangers' duties were. He said, "I'm from time to time to use my best endeavors to distress the French and their allies by sacking, burning, and destroying their houses, barns, barracks, canoes, bateaux, killing their cattle, and at all times endeavor just to wreak havoc out there on any type of French settlements." It didn't matter. Any type of damage that he could inflict on the French, whether it was just their civilians or their military, was going to be an aid to the British Army. And also, there's also a really good description of these early Rangers that kind of goes along with the fact that they were just given money to provide their own clothing. A body of Rangers under the command of Captain Rogers, who arrived with the other troops from the southward, march out every day to scour the country. Again, they're seeking intelligence of the enemy and things like that. These light troops, and again, you start to see, this was actually a description given by Captain John Knox. He was a British military officer. He's calling them light troops. Not a new concept, but he recognizes these are quick-moving troops. They have at present no particular uniform, only they wear their clothes short. I'm assuming that was for, I don't know why that was for. It's just one of those things that they wear your clothes short. I could say, okay, it worked better in the woods, but I don't know that for sure. So they wear their clothes short. They're armed with a firelock, tomahawk, or small hatchet, and a scalping knife. A bullock's horn full of powder hangs under the right arm by a belt from the left shoulder. A leathern or sealskin bag buckled around their waist, which hangs down before it, contains bullets and a smaller shot the size of full-grown peas. 6 or 7 of with a ball they generally load. Their officers carry a small compass fixed in the bottom of their powder horns, by which to direct them had to lose themselves in the woods. Now, a quote like this is a boon to a reenactor, because it really gives me an idea of what I want to look like and what I want to use if I'm portraying an early Ranger. Okay, this is a painting, or actually it's a print, by a good friend of mine, Gary Zaboli. He's a well-known Ranger researcher. And Gary himself will admit now, if he had to go back and do a lot of his prints over again, things have changed so much that he would change them as well. But the reason I like this is it basically shows the early duties of the Ranger. they're spying on one of the French fortifications. It's really a hodgepodge of clothing and gear, and it also shows one of the native Rangers that are with them. So early in Rogers' career and his Rangers, this is pretty much probably what you would have seen. Stuff like nice beaded gun cases and stuff like that, probably not so much. But this is a good representation of some of your early Rangers.
Were they paid the Indians?
Yes. Yeah. The Rangers actually, the native companies had their own native officers. They were actually asked to dress in their traditional manner. They wanted that look about their natives, things like this. And yeah, they were paid and provisioned pretty much the same way that the Rangers were. Another thing that I mentioned earlier, but made Rogers and his men kind of unique, is they continued the war effort over the winter months. When the English army normally went into winter quarters, nothing was happening. But the French allied natives and the French partisan troops, winter didn't bother them. I mean, they grew up in Canada. That was just normal travel to them. So you had a lot of reconnaissance being done on the English army. So Rogers and his men actually became pretty good, even though they were playing a game of catch-up, at going out and doing reconnaissance and intelligence missions during the middle of the winter. They would actually take ice skates, skate up the frozen surface of Lake George, get to the north end of Lake George, put their snowshoes on, and go and spy on the French outposts. That allowed them to get in and out quickly. Something that really had not been used by the English army before. Even in times of deep snow and things like that, these items allowed them to get in and out very quickly. This is another illustration that, again, Gary Zaboli did. Now this one, Gary's starting to evolve as his knowledge of Rogers Rangers increased. And basically, a ranger officer is getting ready to send his men out on a patrol. You can see they've got ice creepers on, their snowshoes on their backs, and a set of ice skates. Again, hodgepodge of uniforms and things like that. But this is a really good illustration that shows Rogers and his Rangers during their winter missions and things like that. This is a group of a couple reenactors from Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga in the last few years, I mean, I went there for like 20 years to their reenactment and things like this, but Fort Ticonderoga is really kind of starting to evolve the way that they look at their Rangers and their things and stuff too. And this is a couple of their interpreters up there showing Rangers in winter duty and things like that. And again, no head-to-toe green. He's got a pair of red leggings on. He's utilizing a blanket coat, knitted caps and things like that. It's just another real good picture of guys that are starting to use the better research that we're getting, the more knowledge that we're getting about Rogers Rangers. And this was a double-edged sword, though. Even though they were starting to get good at these winter patrols, they were still playing a catch-up game to the French and the natives who had used this stuff for years. I mean, this was not a new concept. Ice skates actually were used by Native Americans, made of bone and antler and things like that years ago. They were really trying to catch up to what was already out there, and they were also going against somebody who was masters of this game of winter warfare. And when you're operating behind enemy lines the way the Rangers did, you're gonna eventually run into trouble. And in January 1757, Rogers and approximately 80 of his Rangers were out scouting towards Crown Point and the new installation that they had built at Ticonderoga. And they saw a horse-drawn sled going up the frozen surface of the lake. What this was communication or a supply run between Forts Caroline and the Fort St. Frederick at Crown Point. Well, Rogers thought, hey, I could get some prisoners, maybe get some plunder. So he sent his men out, and they ambushed the sled, and they captured it very quickly. Well, the only problem was it was not one sled, it was several sleds. And the other sleds quickly ran back to the fort that they were coming from. And so here's Rogers stuck between two fortifications that would quickly be able to send troops out. Again, masters of winter warfare. And they were able to set up an ambush for Rogers. And the battle really was fought to a standstill until nightfall. But this was the first time that Rogers and his men had really met with any type of losses in their patrols and things like this. Rogers himself was wounded twice in this battle. It was actually a good learning experience, even though it was basically a defeat for him. And here's another Gary Zaboli account, and you can see how disjointed this battle is. I mean, they actually retreated to a piece of high ground and kept some men in reserve and basically kept the French at bay until their ammunition was almost exhausted. And regardless of this, the Ranger companies, especially Rogers and his men, had really proven themselves to be vital to the British war effort by this time. The Duke of Cumberland, actually back in England while he's directing the war going on in Europe, said, you know, you need to have more of this. But he also heard rumors of problems with Rangers and their discipline and things. So he came up with an idea that maybe we can start to incorporate these Ranger tactics into the British Army. And that way I can have my British regular discipline, but I can use these Ranger tactics. So he came up with an idea to send volunteers from many of his regiments, as well as some gentleman volunteers, to go into a cadet company under Rogers' own command, and he wanted them to learn the Rangers' discipline or their methods of fighting and their tactics. And so Rogers took these men under his direct supervision to train them in the ranging or wood service under my command and inspection, with particular orders for him to instruct them to the utmost of his power in their method or ranging discipline, how they marched, retreated, ambushed, fighting, so that they may be better qualified for any future service against the enemy. This lasted for about 7 weeks. The next campaign dictated that these men go back to their regiments and things like this. But it really shows how vital that the ranging style of fighting and the Rangers themselves have become to the British Army. And so in order to better train these men, Rogers came up with a series of rules. Everybody knows them as Rogers rules of ranging. It was 28 rules that he and his men used in the ranging service. And many historians actually believe this may be one of the first military manuals that was ever written in North America. A variation of these rules, you'll still see them out there, and they were actually redistributed in World War II to the revamped United States Army Rangers. This is another Gary Zaboli print. This is a cadet in his ranging company, or the Cadet Company. You can see that the clothes are cut shorter. He doesn't have the long tails that would normally be on a regimental coat. He's adapted a set of native leggings instead of gaiters to his lower legs. He's using a tump line to carry his blanket and his pack. He's got a belly box, and it looks like a cartridge pouch, but he's also begun to utilize a powder horn. And go back to that just a second, Beth. You see over here, there's a hatchet, just the head of a hatchet. They began to start putting their bayonets away and their swords because the hatchet was a better useful tool for them. And one other thing that Gary shows, and although I'm sure this probably doesn't look like what they were, but this gentleman is carrying a rifle. A few years back, we actually found a receipt. I didn't find it. I was a benefit of this knowledge from another researcher. But we found a receipt for when these men came out of their regiments, they turned their regular service muskets in, and they were issued rifle barrel carbines to be used during their training under Rogers and his cadet company. They actually found the receipt where they turned these rifle barrel carbines back in. So that's kind of an interesting thing that you start to see another tactic that the Rangers may have been using with the rifle barrel gun. So basically this cadet company was the forerunner of what we now know as light infantry companies in your modern military today. They started to integrate them within the British Army. The main goal of the cadet company not only was to instill discipline or to get away from the lack of discipline with the Rangers and allow the regulars to emulate their tactics with the regular discipline, but it was also a money-saving move. The Rangers were actually pretty expensive. They never really were able to get away from their reliance on the Colonial Ranger units though. But this experiment did directly lead to the integration of Ranger tactics, dress, weapons, in the House 55th Regiment of Foot, and also the development of Gage's 80th Regiment of Light Infantry. These were just a big reason for, by the time the Revolutionary War came around, light infantry companies in the British Army were the norm, and very well organized and very well utilized. So we're going to get back to those famous green uniforms, those cool green Superman outfits that we all used to wear when we first started doing Rogers Week. And where the green uniforms came from is once Lord Loudon realized that his cadet company experiment wasn't going to work, he was still going to have to keep the Rangers. He decided maybe I can get them to bring their discipline together on their own, maybe make them feel more like soldiers. So he ordered additional companies of Rangers to be raised, but he also wanted them to start to look like soldiers. And so you see the first attempt at uniforming Rogers Rangers. He wanted them to provide themselves with good warm clothing, but they must be uniform in every company. Now that's a big, broad spectrum of what he meant. Rogers did follow that. He did make an initial order of clothing and uniforms for his Rangers. We don't know of any that exist. I mean, maybe one day we'll get lucky and somebody will find one in somebody's attic. Right now we don't know what they look like, but we do have a nice description of kind of what he used. The clothes that Rogers had made for his people are chiefly a green bath rug, which that just meant it wasn't a bath rug. It was made in Bath, England. It was kind of a coarse woolen cloth. That really bothered me for a lot of years, especially my early years. But the rest of the cloths were low-priced green cloth. He was trying to be a little economic, especially that the eyeball was on him a little bit for the cost of his Rangers. Metal buttons, silver lace on some hats, or silver lace hats, some of them silver lace cord or looping on the jackets, all lined in green. Like I said, this was the only known order that he ever made for his Rangers. I don't know how many he ordered. I don't know what they look like. All I know is green, and they were cheap. A future order was planned in June of 1758, but it had never been placed. So I think that even late in the war, instead of seeing groups of uniformed Rangers, you probably didn't. You probably started to see a prevalence for green coats or green clothing and things like that. but I don't think you saw a lot. It was about this time that Rogers suffered his worst defeat of the French and Indian War, the Second Battle of Snowshoes. Again, in the winter months, he was out to scout French positions along the lake in preparation for that spring's campaign. And he saw about 90 natives coming down this frozen surface of this stream. The natives were using that surface because it was easier than traveling through the deep snow. And he thought, hey, here's a prime target. He formed a quick ambush. He hit those 90 natives with devastating results from his first volley. His men ran down to start to scalp the dead and the wounded, and he thought he was going to take a lot of prisoners and get a lot of plunder. Well, the only problem is it was just the advance guard of a much larger French force. And they basically pretty much surrounded Rogers and his men. He suffered almost 120 casualties in this engagement. Finally, they were almost out of ammunition. They just scattered. One of Rogers' rules was, in the event of something like this, to everybody scatter, take their own path, and we'll meet up at a rendezvous point. But it was one of his worst defeats, the worst defeat that he had, and had they not been able to escape that night during darkness, probably would have been wiped out to the men because they were so close to the French forts. The French could sally men, ammunition, provisions, and things like that out very quickly. And this shows another, Gary Zaboli, shows the natives coming down that frozen creek bed in the ambush that he set up for his Rangers, which he thought was a prize-winning day, and it quickly turned, the tables were quickly turned on him. And even though they suffered defeats like this, they became a big part of the Army. As their skill increases and the campaigns got bigger, especially in '58 when you had your huge campaign against Fort Ticonderoga, the Rangers began to not only act as their intelligence gathering like they always had, they began to act as forward, rear, flank guards for these larger expeditions. And the Rangers really, this was the time that they were at their largest numbers. Some historians estimate them that they were about 1,000 men at this time. So it really shows you how vital they become to be part of the Army. They would continue to play vital roles throughout the rest of the campaign. 1758 campaign and 59 campaigns against Fort Ticonderoga. The 58 Louisburg campaign, the Rangers actually played a big part in that, and as they scoured the countryside looking for trouble from the inhabitants while the main siege of Louisburg was going on. 59, the fortress city of Quebec, big part in that campaign. They also completed a daring mission against the Abenaki village of St. Francis. St. Francis natives were held responsible by the colonies, even though it may not have been them all the time, about raids into the New England colonies. And Amherst wanted these Abenakis punished also because they had captured a British regular who was supposed to be on a communications trip or a trip of truce, and he was actually acting as a spy, trying to find out what was happening in one campaign while another one was going on. So he wanted them, he wanted the village of St. Francis attacked and these enemies defeated or punished. It was really a long trip for colonial times, some of the worst terrain that you could ever see. The attack itself was kind of, I mean, they ended up burning the village of St. Francis, but you really don't know how many natives were actually there and what their casualties were. Rogers was kind of a self-promoting guy. He said, yeah, I killed 200 natives. There might have been 20. You know, things you just don't know. But they did complete their mission. Now, the only problem is they had so far to come home, and they couldn't return by the route that they intended. So he lost a bunch of men to starvation. They became lost in the woods. Natives, of course, and French began to chase them, trying to catch up with them almost immediately. It was a high point and something that they always talk about. The movie Northwest Passage with Spencer Tracy is about the St. Francis raid, but really it devastated his Ranger Corps. They would play a prominent role in the 1760 campaign. They were with Haviland as he made his way up the lakes, up the Richelieu River towards Montreal. That was the last campaign, basically spelled disaster for French influence in North America. Rogers had become a major when they augmented his Ranger groups. He actually was one of General Amherst's favorites. He actually gave Robert Rogers the honor of traveling to Detroit, Michilimackinac, and the Illinois Territory to take the surrender of those French posts after the surrender of Montreal, where the governor of France surrendered these posts to the English. He was only able to accept the surrender of Detroit. It was so advanced in the season that even though we tried to travel overland up to the Straits in Michigan, he was unable to make it. It would be another year until these posts were actually able to be taken and surrendered to the British. But it was really a big honor for him to be chosen for that command of that expedition, especially for somebody who was just a provincial ranger. This is another Gary Zawoli print, and it shows Robert Rogers at his personal zenith at Fort Detroit. He's accepted the surrender of the post. The British flag flies over the ramparts. He's in his dress uniform with his silver lace and his cord and his looping and things like that. And probably by the time he got to Detroit, he's probably filthy and didn't look anything like this. But this is kind of a Superman pose that we put in here for him. Here's another one. This shows, I like this print. This is the 58 campaign against Ticonderoga. This is a member of Gage's 80th Light Infantry. You can see where they're trying to integrate Ranger dress and styles and things like that into the regular British Army. This is one of Rogers' native captains. Rogers himself, stern look on his face for Superman. But it's just kind of a neat print, but it's one of those ones that you got to take with a grain of salt because it's romanticized. So, we talked earlier about Robert Rogers. We don't know what he looks like. The family discounts the print that was out there and everything. But is this man right here Robert Rogers? This painting was found in a coal shed in England. It was painted by a man named Thomas Davies. He was not only a painter, but he was an officer in the British Royal Artillery. And he was over here during the French and Indian War, and he also served over here during the Revolutionary War. This is a painting that he did of the encampment at the south end of Lake George in 1759, before they began their final thrust that would see the surrender of Crown Point and Ticonderoga. And he painted this painting of the encampment. You can see a beautiful lake and the hills and things. If you've ever been up that way, it's a gorgeous sight. Fort William Henry, this was basically close to the ruins, but it's the encampment on the beach before they began their flotilla up the lake towards Ticonderoga. And he painted this picture, but this guy in the foreground, you think, wow, this guy's all in green, he's with a native. So who is this guy? Well, Thomas Davy kept sketchbooks. The one that he used during the Revolutionary War still exists. They've never found a sketchbook from the French and Indian War. We don't know whether it's out there somewhere. But through his sketchbook, a lot of his other paintings from the Revolutionary War, you know who the subjects are and you know what the place was and things like this. They don't know the particulars about this other than it's a 1759 encampment at Lake George. Next slide. Now, the one thing about Davies is while he was doing his duties as an officer in the Royal Artillery, is he actually went out on scouts with Robert Rogers and his Rangers, trying to learn some of their tactics and things like this. So it's very possible that Davies may have painted Rogers. It could be one of his Rangers with one of his Ranger native, company officers. I don't know. The details of it, what can you tell? Could have been the artist's license. He could have changed things. But we do see green head to toe, native style leggings, powder horn, a long musket, just a few details and things like this. Is it Robert Rogers? I can't tell you that it is. I wish I could, but I actually believe that this is a Ranger if it's not Rogers himself. And it at least gives us a little bit of glimpse of possibly what the Rangers look like at this time. But again, like I said, I can't say so for sure. And that's just another detail showing him. So I have no idea how long I went. How long did I go about? Oh, that's not too bad. Not too bad. So, anywho, I know we've got a great presentation coming up from Erica right after me. If I can answer any quick questions, I'd be more than happy to. I will be doing a book signing, like they said, and I'll be here the rest of the day. So I'd be more than happy, to answer questions now if anybody wants to get a drink or something before Erica starts and things like that. But if you have some quick questions, I'd be more than happy to try to answer them. Wow, I did a good job. Yes, ma'am.
The hatchets that they were carrying, were they really as heavy as the things we see displayed here?
That right there. That's actually a reproduction of one that was found along Braddock's Road. Very, very light hatchet. All right, well, thank you very much. I hope that I didn't bore you too bad. Bill actually yesterday described me as an expert on Rogers Rangers. I'm not an expert on Rogers Rangers or anything else that I talk about. I make my living as a mechanic. I don't consider myself an author, even though I've written a ton of stuff. I consider myself a sharer. I found stuff and I share it with people, and I hope that and I've been lucky that a lot of times they've enjoyed the things that I've been able to share. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt.